Why, hello, beloved line readers, friends, and family. And we know that some family are among our paid subscribers and readers, and we love you most of all. Today we are doing our, what is this, Matt? Our fourth video, our third video? I've lost track. Well, for those of you who may not be aware, our weekly Friday dispatches are now behind the paywall. And in order to entice those among you who have not yet paid to subscribe to the line to join our growing club of true friends, family members, and allied and loyal readers, we are starting a little video that gives you some insight into what we're going to go put in the dispatch and why, and Matt and I basically talking through some of the issues. Now, not everything we discuss during this video sometimes makes the dispatch. Sometimes news happens, we just wind up writing about other things. But generally speaking, this gives you a sense of the editorial process behind those dispatches. And we hope that you enjoy them.
Basically, Jen, this is the equivalent of like we're showing like a cooking style show of making delicious food, but you don't get to eat it unless you actually show up at the restaurant and pay. Folks, we should also mention whether or not you're going to read the dispatch or you're just watching this video. We're going to acknowledge the dispatch we're coming out with this weekend is in large part a placeholder dispatch, and the reason it is quite simply because we, like you and almost 40 million of our buddies, we're waiting for Monday. We don't know what the election is going to bring, and when it happens we'll be ready for it. But it's got, I mean, the theme of our dispatch is theatrical shrug, like I don't know, and that is something we will put in this dispatch. Jen, I have on my radio show this week, I host a radio show every day on Sirius XM. Every time I've had someone come on to talk the federal election, I have made a point of saying I don't have any idea what's going to happen. And I'm not just doing this to showcase my own humility. I mean that very literally. These polls are all within margins of error of each other. There has been fairly rapid movement in growth of the People's Party support, which I've been writing about at the line quite a bit this week. I don't know how much of that's going to show up on voting day. I don't know how loyal the NDP will stay. I don't know how high the bloc will surge in Quebec, because they're starting to surge now. I don't know any of these things, and I don't know. Here's a final. I don't know. I don't know if the polls will actually catch it. Like, we've seen elections before where what ends up happening becomes easy to understand in hindsight, because you realize the polls were catching it in the days immediately running up to the election, but didn't get out in time to actually inform you. So my guess, Jen, is a reduced liberal minority, but I would say everything from a slim liberal majority all the way through to a fairly robust conservative minority is possible.
Yeah, so I think that we're going to start the dispatch with a little blurb that just sort of explains the outlines of our uncertainty, and says, yes, I mean, something between a liberal majority and a conservative majority is technically possible here. There are pathways to victory, but the most probable outcome appears to be some kind of plurality or some kind of minority government. That said, there are so many unknowns here that, like, you'd be insane to make a prediction. One is, of course, how close the polls have all been, the margin of error, the quality of the polls, last minute voting intention shifts that the polls will not catch, any kind of like impact that, for example, what's happening in Alberta might have in this election is a part of the uncertainty. The actual voter turnout of the PPC is just like that will probably make the difference between a majority government and a minority government, frankly, if those people turn out. But as you have carefully laid out, the average PPC voter is both largely politically disengaged and young. So, like, whether or not polling support actually turns out into voting support is a really, really interesting question. What are the other uncertainty factors here? What, like, turnout as a result of reduced polling stations,
Yeah.
as a result of COVID could be a huge factor.
Mail-in and early voting.
Mail-in early voting is a huge factor. Like, there are just way too many balls in this particular air. So I think that the first dispatch is just going to sort of lay out, the first blurb is just going to lay out like the uncertainty factor. And like, I think we could title the dispatch like the uncertainty factor. So
yeah, I mean, I don't have a better headline. I'm looking right now, everyone can see, I'm looking at the last 10 polls to come out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Here's the last 10 polls in terms of recently being released. Liberals up 4, Liberals up 1, Liberals up 4, Conservatives 1, tie, Conservatives up 1, tie, Liberals up 2, Conservatives up 2, Liberals up 1.
So the trend is Liberals up. The trend is overall Liberals up.
Liberals
But I mean,
improving, but pulling into a tie with the Conservatives, right? Like,
yeah.
Uh,
Also, like it's just, and also a lot of the problem with Canadian polling is just like it's just not accurate compared to American polling because there's just not enough money in this particular industry up here. So as a result, these margin of errors, they could mean anything at this point.
my usual default assumption is that the Conservatives will overperform. I don't mean dramatically so, but I tend to think conservative support. You know what? This is actually totally gut level. I could easily go back and check this. My gut tells me, though, that the Conservatives often do maybe a point better than people expect them to, which would put us still within the margin of error here. Like if the Conservatives catch the high side of the margin of error, maybe they win 140 seats. If the Liberals catch the high side of the margin of error, maybe they win 170. I honestly, I don't know, the uncertainty factor. The other thing I want to talk about is something that probably landed too late in the election campaign to matter, if it was ever going to matter at all, and I'm not sure it was going to. It was announced late this week that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia were forming a new tri-party defense and security arrangement for the Indo-Pacific region. Canada of late has actually been becoming more active in that region. We've been deploying our ships more aggressively. We've been working with the Australians, the Americans, the Japanese, the Indians. Kind of for the first time in a while, there's been a real Canadian naval presence that is deliberately making itself felt in that region. So when I heard that we weren't being invited, or actually, I'll rephrase that, when I heard that we weren't part of it, three thoughts immediately came to mind. One of them could be we're going to be, but we can't announce it during a election because of the caretaker convention. Right now, while the election is happening, the federal government is in caretaker mode. We couldn't sign a new multilateral defense agreement in a caretaker election. Maybe if Justin Trudeau is reelected on Monday, his first announcement is, by the way, we're joining. Like, and it was all negotiated in advance, but that's possible. I don't think so, though, because I think if we were, I think our allies wait a week.
They would have waited. They would have waited a week. Yeah.
Because the conservative, it's either going to be the Liberals or the Conservatives, and the Conservatives would jump all over something like this.
Yeah. So if we were at this table, they wouldn't have done this during the election.
So
if we were at this table, truth be told, the election probably wouldn't have happened.
Possibly. We might have waited on that. So that leaves us with two options, one of which is that we weren't invited. The other option was that we were invited and passed. And there was an essay that came out, and I'll link to it in the dispatch. It was, oh gosh, I forget who it was, but I have it bookmarked here. I thought it was a really, really useful encapsulation of not only Canada's position in this, but the Liberals' position in general. And the comment on the Canadian position that I thought was very clever was that we talk about being a coast to coast to coast, a three ocean country. We're a Pacific trading nation. No, we're not. Like, when I said before that we've actually been making our presence felt in the Pacific region more than usual, we are more than usual, but that's like a ship at a time. We are not in any meaningful way a player in the Pacific, and we are obviously very nervous about our relationship with China for a lot of reasons, some good, some bad. I don't know if we want to become a major player in the Pacific. The other thing is, even if we wanted to, I don't know if Conservatives or Liberals want to spend the bucks on the kind of military capacity we would have to do that. And in a weird way, the only kind of military capacity we would need would be what we have in theory pledged to purchase or procure. But as you'll note, all those procurements tend to kind of drag out. No one wants to spend the money right now on a big fleet of shiny new warships and submarines.
Matt, I think there's a simpler answer to all of this.
Yeah, but I mean, I like complicated answers because they make good dispatches.
Okay, well, fair enough. I mean, the one quick question: New Zealand's not in this pact, is it? Right?
Not at present, no. So that's one of the other Five Eyes countries that is noticeably absent.
I think the actual answer here is pretty obvious, and that is essentially they've effectively disbanded Five Eyes, reformed it with us not in it.
Sort of yes and no. I mean, the Five Eyes is intelligence sharing. This new agreement seems to be more actual kinetic military forces.
Well,
So,
we don't have any. Our military is decayed. We're useless on that front,
and I
and
think that's
also
it.
I think our military is useless on that front. And then at the second time, I mean, all of our intelligence is highly suspect because, I mean, our relationship with the Chinese, and particularly the liberals' relationship with the Chinese, makes us highly suspect. We're not
We
reliable
do have
partners.
some good intelligence capacities. We also have some geographic advantages. Canadian territory is well positioned to spy on certain people, so that is some of our contribution to the Five Eyes. The other point I'll make though in the dispatch, and I'm going to rip it out of that essay, I thought it was a comment on the three-party Pacific Alliance, but I thought it actually was a brilliant meta commentary on the liberals' time in power, which is that they have studiously ignored the geopolitical and foreign policy developments they just don't want to deal with. And they don't want to deal with it because they don't want to spend the bucks. They don't want to deal with it because it's awkward with China. They don't want to deal with it because it kind of clashes with the liberal specific worldview of Canada and and our place in the world. But whatever it comes down to, yeah, exactly. But what it boils down to is we're just ignoring shit that we don't want to deal with. And to me, if you want to look at a pretty good encapsulation of this election campaign, but also maybe the last 6 years, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and I mean, this is actually why the defense pact matters, and also why it won't become an election issue, but should. So, I mean, that should actually be the theme of this election. Themes that should have been an election issue, but weren't, because the problems are too complicated and we don't know how to solve them. And they don't have simple, pat, talking point level ready answers that have been focus grouped to death. Like, that's actually the entire theme of this entire pointless, stupid exercise of this election. So yeah, I think you writing something on the defense pact is really important. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is Kenny's the impact of what's happening in Alberta. That was one thing that got cut out of my column. I was going to try and talk about what kind of impact Alberta's current slow motion collapse is going to have on the federal election. Because I'm now terrified of making any kind of prediction. I think the answer is either it will have a very significant last minute impact or absolutely no impact at all. And I think I'm going to just kind of make both of those cases. Just say unknowable, because we can't, I don't have the tools. I don't even have the tools to try and assess this. I mean, on one hand, I can make the argument that yes, it doesn't look good for conservatives and conservative ideology that this is happening in Alberta. It does suggest it hints at the idea that conservative governments are not well equipped ideologically to manage mass action kind of problems. Yeah. I don't know if that analysis actually holds out. Indicative of personal failures of leadership as opposed to necessarily ideological failures of leadership. I mean, you can create, the great thing about conservatism is that it can really mean anything you want it to mean. You can make a conservative case for just about any kind of action. The failures here, I think, are all about what's happening inside these caucuses, along with what's happening inside the heads and sort of approaches of the people in question. I have a hard time separating the individual circumstances out of the outcomes here. And the other problem that I think a lot of this rests on is that the public health measures, if you actually strip away the personality, strip away the emotion, the public health measures that get introduced in respective provinces aren't that different, and they're not that far apart. I mean, yep. by the time BC introduces its vaccine its vaccine passport, and Alberta introduces its vaccine passport, the actual substantive difference is going to be 10 days. It's these aren't radically different. Nobody is taking some really, really radically different approach. They're just taking they're all just variations on a theme.
It's funny. So Alberta was taking the radically different approach. I mean, Alberta was the only province that basically said, fuck it, best summer ever. While, everyone else in the rest of the country went, I don't know about that. So now Alberta is sort of moving back into to step with the others.
Yeah, and every other province eased restrictions to some extent.
Oh no, Ontario, we're not back to normal, but we're pretty
close.
We're getting
Saskatchewan did. Nobody went through the last summer in total lockdown. People more or less, like I said, it was the difference between Alberta and Ontario was one of degrees. It wasn't. Yeah. What the real difference was in rhetoric and communications and messaging, which is actually what blankered Kenny. But now I'm getting back into my column. So I think that the question about what the impact of this on the federal race is, you can make an argument that yes, it tarnishes conservatism. If this is what this is, I don't think so. It tarnishes conservatism at large. the counter argument to that is like most people in Canada don't actually care that much about Alberta's whatever, and Alberta is filled with yahoos, and of course this was going to happen.
I, you
So
know, I
to what
have
extent is this an extent a reflection of O'Toole?
I have three things to say in reply to that. The first is that you were intimidating me with your pen, which you were using to decisive dramatic effect. So I reached for something to kind of be on an equal footing, and I realized,
we have a rapport. We have a rapport because we're always mimicking each other's body language. That's
oh,
what's
that's
really
true.
funny.
I just realized though that what I ended up doing was grabbing a Paw Patrol pen that was probably
it's not as
pencil.
It's not nearly as nice as
No,
my last Christmas gift, which is, by the way, an absolutely beautiful, like for the pen nerds out there, it's the Pilot Decimo.
Yeah, well,
it's a more feminine version of the Vanishing Point, and I have Lanny.
This is a Paw Patrol pencil I had to take the eraser off of because my dog wanted to eat it. So I'm not exactly on an equal footing there. 2 points I would make though about the Alberta stuff and the conservatism stuff in general. First of all, I have been talking to some of my conservative contacts this week, basically saying, "Are you worried about the Alberta stuff?" And they're not happy about it. Like they don't consider this a plus. This is not something that they're like, "Oh, this is great," but they don't know if there's enough time left for this to actually matter, and they also don't know if this is going to be an issue that is in the ridings they are worried about. The ridings where they're close and they're competitive in, and those are largely in the 905 in British Columbia and a few in Atlantic, although the Atlantic doesn't look good for the Conservatives as it did a few weeks ago. I don't think Alberta problems are going to be what tips that. It's either going to be national level issues like Justin Trudeau's personality versus Aaron O'Toole's personality, or it's going to be something really micro, like something very local. So Alberta might swing seats in Alberta in the federal election, but other than that, I don't think so. The third point I would make, and it does follow up on what you were talking about before, about how we have been talking about whether or not this does any damage to conservatism as an ideology. I think it does a little bit, and I mean that more so in the credibility side of it, rather than it disproves the ideology. Something I've told you since the beginning of this thing was that even though I am generally politically conservative, I think because I'm a military and national defense geek, I was ideologically comfortable with the idea of using the power of the state. Like when your neighboring empire bombs your naval base, like your response isn't free market economics. It's you build 300 aircraft carriers and you go and you kill them. Like the state has mobilization powers in wartime, and pandemic is very much like a wartime. So I was more comfortable with that than I think a lot of conservatives were. I think I could make that switch early, but I will say this though. I think the failures have actually been evenly divided here. And I know this is going to sound like both sides, on both sides in this. I actually made a joke about that in a column I wrote earlier in this week for TVO. Yeah, I'm going to both sides this. But I think there have been two distinct failures in our pandemic response. One is that conservatives have not understood or have been uncomfortable with when and how to use the coercive powers of the state. Mm-hmm. The other argument I would say on the progressive side, their failure has been that they have consistently overestimated how effective those powers are.
Yeah, so, I think that's right.
And I think it's kind of like conservatives have failed to go, you know what, this is one of those things where we can't individual responsibility and low taxes our way out of it. This is a time to go to a wartime footing. Whereas the progs have been like, we're on a wartime footing. Why aren't things changing? Because we have no state capacity. We've talked about this in columns I've written, in columns you've written, in dispatches. Canadian government is frantically pulling the levers of power, and they're not connected to anything.
Nothing's moving. Yeah. So, and the other thing that I think that is actually astonishing here, and this is something my husband's brought up to me multiple times, is like we have literally spent the same amount of money as it would have taken to like uniform and stick 4 million men in battle. Like that is the scale of the spending that we've adopted. Yeah. And yet our ICU capacity is about the same as it was today as it was 20 months ago.
Oh, no, I mean, it is exactly the same. Because even when we surge stuff, we're just ripping that out of some other part of the healthcare.
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially, like the scope of our institutional failure to actually do what was necessary to expand capacity in the time frame that it had, and given the resources we had and the money we've spent, is actually the astonishing failure here. And like that is the thing that I think is worth reckoning with. I mean, I'd also note that this is what's interesting to me, is that our fundamental ideological divide between you and I is right here. Like I am the civil libertarian style conservative-ish, I guess. Like I could just as easily argue for a leftist argument as I could for a rightist argument, a lot of times. But I mean, my core belief system is rooted in civil libertarianism. It's a form of like, yes, I understand that I'm not a libertarian, but like I understand that it can be necessary for governments to take coercive action against their citizens or in opposition of their citizens. But from my perspective, that should always be limited, and it should always be the last possible recourse, and it should always be grounded and guided by a healthy and robust dissent and debate. And that's I think that my sort of squeamishness around a lot of our COVID issues to date. Like have always been on the fence when it comes to vaccine passports, for example. Like I could argue and have argued both sides of that fence. I honestly could. I could fall on either side of that line. But if we're going to go there, I think that we do need to have that debate. That needs to, like, we need to come to a general consensus that that's the necessary thing to do. And also, I do think that it has to be limited in time in some way, and it hasn't been, and that bothers me. And I do think also I have to be convinced that we're out of options. It's the last possible kind of resort before you move into more and more coercive measures. In Alberta's case, I think that the last test is met. Like we've run out of choices. We just have to do it. It's just that we're at the end of the rope. But I will always be a little bit on that sort of, I don't know if you call it Burkean conservative style, where I'm just like, slow down, let's think this through, and like, are we sure? Like, I mean, we were both having this conversation in the context of 9/11, and like, after 9/11, I went like full on punk Adbuster style 17-year-old useless, where I was just like, we shouldn't be going into Afghanistan. And that was mostly because I saw everybody sort of come to this unanimous consensus that going into Afghanistan was necessary. It's actually a good impulse. You need assholes like me around, because otherwise you're just going to stumble into absolutely everything. But sometimes that impulse is wrong, and it's just what it is.
Well, the problem is, I mean, you're right. We need all kinds in society, and I'm generally a free market, small government, individual liberties guy, except when it's time to go to war with someone, in which case we all get drafted into the army. Like our societies only work if they're secure and they're stable. Like if I had a philosophical credo, it would be that liberal democracy can only work in an environment of security and stability. And we in this country don't prioritize that because we don't think about it. We never worry about it because we've always been the protected subject of the global superpower. That's changing, first of all. But it's not that I'm arguing.
Like, I think I want to meditate on that a little bit. I want to meditate on this idea that security and because I mean,
everything we have, how do you find? We're not worried about pirates.
No, I know, but security and stability can mean a lot of different things. And you can expand that concept out in order to chip away at sort of civil liberties pretty extensively over time.
You absolutely can. You can also underinvest to the point that you get raided by pirates. Like, I don't know where that exact middle ground is, but I suspect that Canada is leaning way too much in the we're going to get invaded by pirates direction, and we're not going to recognize it when it comes. We do have to keep going, though. A couple other things. Our colleague Andrew Potter, who's one of our regular contributors, and he does contribute to our dispatches here. He helps us out on the editing sometimes when you and I are overwhelmed. He's going to contribute a dispatch blurb this week, and I'm not going to say much about it because I honestly don't know what he's going to write, but he is going to talk about the return of the old guard, the old guys to the campaign trail. The Liberals trotted out Jean Chrétien this week. The Conservatives countered with Brian Mulroney. I don't know what Andrew's going to say about it. I look forward to reading it because when I saw both those things happen, I went, oh, that's interesting, but I'm way too busy to develop any thoughts or feelings about it.
It's Andrew is very like ragey about this campaign is kind of my read on this. It's like there's a lot of anger. So we'll see how that goes. I'm really looking forward to reading his dispatch. He's also promised us something for Monday. So that actually is kind of bird's eye view and looks at some of the national problems we're dealing with, which is, I think, really excellent.
We are going to honor, you and I are both originally newspaper people. We're not currently. I mean, I write for the newspaper, so do you occasionally, but the newspaper tradition was not to run endorsements on election day. And we're going to honor that. We're not going to run any overtly partisan commentary or political commentary on election day, because that's the day that you decide. And I know it's a little it's a little sentimental of us, but we did come out of newspapers, so we will honor that tradition. You run your endorsement editorial before election day, but you give people the day of itself to think, to make up their own minds, and to execute their democratic franchise. So we will honor that here at the Line, which, as another programming note, means we will accelerate our bullshit bulletin, which we've been running on Mondays. We'll accelerate that to Sunday, so we'll have our last dig at all the idiocy on the campaign.
There have been a couple of ones. There have been a couple of good ones over the last few days. So there you go.
And so that will be on Sunday. Monday we'll run something more philosophical, more top level, that will hopefully get you thinking, but it won't nudge you in any particular direction on the ballot issues, because we don't want to do that. We are also going to mention, simply as a note of congratulations, the Narwhal, another journalism outlet, is expanding. They've made some good hires. Great to see. It's in this industry, it's usually attrition and horrible stuff, so it's nice to see good stuff. So we'll note that
there is a little bit of like a journalism renaissance there. Like I know people have been talking about this for a long time, but I'm actually starting to feel like maybe there's some validity to it, where more and more journalists are just actually proving to be successful by going to more independent, less well-known outlets.
I think it's more of a rationalization than a renaissance.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
I think we're adjusting to the affordable scale, which is going to mean, I mean, we've written about this before, even with all these new digital outlets, the actual number of working journalists. Yeah. So we have a small but growing number of digital outlets, but they have 3 or 4 people, which is, does not replace a single mid-sized city newspaper of 70 shutting down, right? So,
and nor do we have the capacity. Like, I mean, we've owned this at the Line before. We can't, don't come to us with your brilliant, terrible investigative story that is going to take a year and a half to report out, because we don't have the money. We don't have the people.
So I mean, you're not wrong. I do think something is happening, but I don't think it's a renaissance. I think well, this is probably a subject for another dispatch, but I would just say it's more of a rationalization and scale, which will involve smart young journalists like we've seen get poached by the Narwhal this week, will be hopefully having good careers in new, nimble organizations, much like us at the Line, who are directly funded by motivated readership bases, who are not advertising dependent, are not government grant dependent, are not sponsored by industry or charitable foundations. These are all viable models, by the way, but you and I made a very conscious decision to make the Line subscriber based. Like, that was not something we stumbled into. We want to only be beholden to the collective reader. I think that will work at a small scale. How big could we grow the Line? Well, I hope we find out, but that's why I'm skeptical that this will be a renaissance. I think we'll end up with in this country, maybe 2 dozen small, independent, scrappy outlets, who probably in total staff will not equal one newspaper circa 1995. All right, that's it for us. We will be back with you soon. It's going to be a busy weekend. It's going to be a busy week. Take care.